Friends, I want to start this morning by telling you about one of the most significant episodes in my memory that occurred when I moved as a 12-year-old from Uruguay to America. My dad, who was trying to make me feel a bit more comfortable in my new country, told me that he wanted to take me to an American public library. I was a bit of a bookworm, okay? Now, I couldn't read anything in English or actually read any of the books, but he had a sense that if I would see a lot of books that one day I could read, I would be a little bit happier with the move and adapt to my country in an easier way. And so I remember walking into this gorgeous, beautiful building, and I was absolutely in awe. Back home, I had never walked into a public space that was so new, that was so clean, that had so many books that I could actually borrow and read one day. And I was extremely, extremely happy. So I thanked my dad for bringing me to this. Can you hear me? Sorry. I thanked my dad for bringing me to this library. I went on to one of the couches, sat down, and promptly took off my shoes. So my dad comes over to me, a little bit worried, and he asked me, Mijal, ¿qué estás haciendo? What are you doing, right? Why are you taking off your shoes in this library? That's not what we're supposed to do here. And I turn to my dad, and I tell him in Spanish. I say, Papi, this is America. This is the land of the free. I was very earnest. We're supposed to be free to do whatever we want, and I want to take off my shoes. And because this is America, I get to take off my shoes in this public library. The 12-year-old me who moved to America had an optimistic narrative of the American dream. I believed in an America that could fulfill its promise of equality and dignity for all its citizens. I believed in an America in where Cesar Chavez's cry, "Si se puede," yes we can, could actually be accomplished, in which you could pursue happiness and achieve the American dream if you just worked hard enough. Now, this version of the American dream that I had as a 12-year-old happened to actually coincide with the version of the American dream that has sustained and inspired the American Jewish experience. The American Jewish experience in America, has contributed to a narrative of American Jewish exceptionalism. American Jews have looked at America as a promised land, as a land that if we only work hard enough, if we only fight for our rights hard enough, we can actually achieve equality and dignity for all its citizens. Our American Jewish narrative has seen America as an exception to history. If anti-Semitism and persecution of Jews was the norm in Europe and many of the countries from where we immigrated, America was the exception. It was different. It was special, a place where not only we could prosper, but we could help other people prosper. This American dream, this American Jewish dream, we can conceptualize it as a minority narrative, right? Yesterday, Ilana spoke about minority narratives, and she pushed us to consider that we must ask messy and difficult questions about nationalism in light of minority narratives. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to look at the American Jewish minority narrative, a narrative of success, and we're going to ask difficult questions about it. Now, part of the reason that I want to do this is because I think that if we spend an entire week, or a little bit more, learning about nationalism, and we reserve our difficult questions only to Zionism and to talking about nationalism in Israel, then we're not being honest enough with ourselves in interrogating our own local commitments in America, in interrogating the narratives that sustain our nationalistic narratives in America, our attachments as American Jews. So we're going to investigate these attachments and these narratives. Now, let me be clear. This American Jewish narrative is not just a story that we tell ourselves that's been informed by our historical experiences. It's also a narrative that I genuinely believe has shaped the way that American Jews have behaved. I believe that this narrative has inspired the American Jewish community to uphold a discourse of tikkun olam, of social consciousness, a discourse that says that if we made it here, and if we still have a memory of having once been oppressed, then we must make sure that we continue fighting the good fight to make sure that other people can make it as well. This narrative has led many of us to speak about American values and Jewish values as either synonymous with each other or aligned very closely with each other. It's a very deep story that many of us hold dear and that shaped the ways that we orient ourselves as American Jews. But the problem is, or one of the problems that I want to note right now, is that this narrative, this American Jewish story, is currently being challenged. Some would say that it's under assault. You can see it being under assault from the far right in America, from voices that tell us that the special relationship between America and its Jews is not a good or correct relationship. Voices that tell us that in fact Americanness and Jewishness are foreign and alien to each other. That's one assault that we have right now in the American Jewish narrative. But there's a second assault that I'm going to classify as coming from the left. An assault that tells us, American Jews, that we are not the natural allies in progressive alliances fighting for social justice. That American Jews, specifically white American Jews, have benefited from white privilege, and as such, don't necessarily belong on the side of the marginalized. Maybe we have more in common with the side of those who are perpetuating oppression on those who are marginalized. Now, both these challenges are important, but I want to focus today on the challenge from the left. And I do so because, as most American Jews, according to many studies, I'm a liberal American Jew. And ideologically, I grapple with and struggle much more with the challenge from the left than the challenge from the far right. So that's what we're going to explore it and focus on it together. Let me flesh out that critique, that challenge a little bit more, okay? One part, and I'm simplifying for the sake of communicating. One part of the critique, of the left critique of the American Jewish narrative, is that we are told that most American Jews, most, not all, really important to qualify that it's important to note they are non-white Jews and Jews of color, and even though we're not going to focus on these populations today, it will be not only incorrect but wrong to speak about American Jews as if we're all white. But for this conversation, I want to focus on the majority of American Jews that are seen as white, okay? So part of the critique says, you American Jews, you've negotiated an identity that benefits from white privilege. You've negotiated an identity that benefits from systems that directly serve white people. And that means that you have to actually own that privilege and think about it and think of yourself as powerful. Another part of this critique says, you American Jews have this beautiful story of American Jewish success and exceptionalism in America. But this story is at the best a myth, at worst an erasure of many other narratives of minority populations who have not been served by the American dream and who haven't had that same access that you've had, that same success. Perpetuating and continuing that narrative is actually maybe an insult or continues perpetuating the oppression against other groups. Another part of the critique says, if you want to join us in intersectional alliances, then you have to come not as a natural ally of another vulnerable population, but you have to come as people who own, recognize, and explore your power, your privilege, and who want to actually make reparations for it. This is a bit of a simplification, but I think a good way to understand some of the critique that's coming right now from the left. Sorry, friends, give me just a second. Yeah. Technical difficulties, but it's all going to be good. Don't worry. We're still going to talk about this. All right. Okay, I just don't want to keep fixing this thing. Thank you. Thank you. This just made the class. Okay. Success. No. Um, now, friends, when we talk, I just spoke about this critique as something somewhat theoretical, based on ideas. But I think if we look back at the Jewish newspapers and Jewish press and what we all read, there's so many events that in my mind actually embody this critique. So many controversies that our communities grapple with and argue about that embody this critique. Let me give you a couple of examples. Remember the controversy around the Women's March? Yeah? Okay, good. We're on the same page. This controversy embodies this critique, right? Any of you ever heard of Jewish college students being told they don't belong in certain progressive intersectional spaces? Okay, good. We're all on the same page. Just this month, earlier this month, there was a Dyke March in Washington, D.C., in which participants were told that they couldn't have a rainbow flag with a Magen David, with a Star of David, a symbol that has a lot of Jewish significance, completely unrelated to Zionism, like besides for Zionism, right? So these are just some of the examples that actually give flesh to this critique. And these examples, by the way, are not only troubling and painful, they're also tearing our communities apart, right? Each of these examples leads to discussions and arguments and reckoning and what should our response be and how do we respond as American Jews and what does this mean, and a little bit of like a tortured conversations inside our communities. So what we're going to do today is as follows. I want to take this critique seriously. I want to try to understand it. Okay? I really want us to try to understand it, to have like a generous understanding of this critique and confront it in a real way. And I want to pose two questions that we're going to explore together. Question number one is the following. First question is a little bit of diagnosis. Why does this critique feel so disorienting and so destabilizing? Because I feel like that, okay? I feel sometimes like disoriented, like, I want to do the right thing, and there's this critique, and I think these are my allies, but they're not my allies, and do I belong? Okay, and I think I'm not the only one. So the first question that I have is, why does this critique feel so destabilizing and so disorienting? That's the first question we're going to put on the table. The second question has less to do with diagnosis and more to do with moral responsibility. The second question is, if we confront this critique in a real way, what is our moral responsibility? Two questions, okay? Diagnosis, why is it so disorienting? And moral responsibility, okay? Let's jump into the first question. Why does this critique feel so disorienting? And to answer this question, I'm going to offer a little bit of a historical narrative. Now, let me give a disclaimer from the get-go for any historians in the room. I'm going to engage in historical simplification, okay, for the sake of providing a neat narrative. And I am not being exhaustive or pretending to cover all the important historical factors. I have made a disclaimer, so just keep it in mind, all right? Good. So now that we gave this disclaimer, let me give my argument. The argument that I want to make with this historical survey. The argument that I want to make is as follows. The reason that the moment right now feels so disorienting and so challenging is because it's actually based on new developments. It's based on new developments. And I'm going to argue that part of what's new and difficult and disorienting and messy and challenging about this moment is that there is a dissonance and a misalignment between the way that we see ourselves and the way that other minority groups in America see themselves. The way that we believe we have to advocate for ourselves and the way that other minority groups in America believe they have to advocate for themselves. All right? To make this argument, I'm going to present 3 different historical phases. Let me name them now, and don't worry, we're going to go into each of them, but let me name them now. Each of these historical phases, I'm going to qualify as describing American Jews trying to answer the question of what does it mean to advocate for yourself as a minority population, okay? In other words, the question could be, what is good for the Jews, okay? What is good for the Jews? Let's be honest. We actually, all of us think that question, right? What is good for the Jews? Phase number 1, I'm going to argue, and don't forget, we're going to go inside. Phase number one, what is good for the Jews? What is good for the Jews, and not just for the Jews, but for other minority groups, what is good, oh, thank you, more technical help. What is, these were just fine yesterday, you know, but we have meetings all the time, great, thank you. What is good for the Jews? Phase one, what is good for the Jews and what is good for other minority communities is to advocate for the rights of all. That's phase one. Phase two, an answer to the question, what is good for the Jews? What is good for the Jews and for other minority communities is for groups to advocate for themselves. Phase three, what is good for the Jews? We don't know yet. We're struggling with it. Okay? So that's the three phases we're going to explore. Let's jump right in. Phase number one, like I said, the question is what is good for the Jews? And the answer is for Jews and for other minority communities, we have to advocate for the rights of all. So if I were to describe historically the time that I'm thinking of for phase one, it would be like the late 1800s and like the first half of the 20th century. Okay? A time in which in America, minority groups who were vulnerable, the way that they advocated for themselves in the public square was to actually say, we need equal rights for everybody. Not just for their group, but for everybody. In terms of the American Jewish experience, this is a time of mass immigration to America. It's also a time of rising nativism and anti-Semitism, a time in which American Jews feel vulnerable, in which they have to figure out how to advocate for their own safety and security in this new country. And so the strategy that they adopt, and let me be clear, this was not just American Jews. This was like the milieu, what people did, right? The strategy they adopt is a strategy in which you go into the public square and you say, we need equal rights for all. And part of your hope is that if those equal rights are realized, it's going to trickle down to your own group as well. I want to look at two examples. Let's go to page 2. First example I want to bring is a famous poem by Emma Lazarus called The New Colossus, which is in the Statue of Liberty. A poem, by the way, which I find really heartbreaking to read right now based on the news that are coming out of our country. And in this poem, she actually raises a beautiful and poignant cry saying that America has to be a land to accept and welcome immigrants and people who are struggling. Now, even though this poem is very famous, what many people don't know is that Emma Lazarus, who was, by the way, a Sephardic Jewish woman from an old Sephardic American family, is that Emma Lazarus was actually a passionate Jewish activist and Jewish writer. She was involved in efforts to help Jewish immigrants. She was really concerned about the plight of Jews, especially in Russia after pogroms and persecution. And she was really active to try and help them. And in some of her other writings, she writes very explicitly about her Jewish identity and her concern for her Jewish group. But this poem symbolizes a different way of advocating for those who are vulnerable. This poem represents what it means to advocate for those who are vulnerable if you speak about everybody and not about a particular group. Lazarus writes, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free." She does not write, "Give me your Jewish tired, your Jewish poor, your Jewish huddled masses yearning to breathe free," right? She's actually embodying a strategy and a set of values also of the day, which said that to actually advocate for those who are vulnerable, you have to speak for everybody. This, again, is both a strategy and it's also a set of values. It signifies a certain optimism that America can actually become the promised land for everybody if we speak about the needs of everybody. We could argue that this type of orientation and attitude, right, of actually advocating for the rights of all, that it culminated in the civil rights movement. I know I'm jumping a little bit historically, but let's do this. That it culminated in the civil rights movement. I want you to turn to the next page, page 3. And I'm going to read to you a speech given by Rabbi Joachim Prinz, who was a refugee from Nazi Germany. And not that many people know this, but he gave this speech in the March in Washington right before Martin Luther King gave his famous I Have a Dream speech. Right? A speech, by the way, in which he speaks about all Americans, right, needing to overcome racism and needing to have an American dream for all Americans. Let's see what he writes. He says, when I was the rabbi of the Jewish community in Berlin under the Hitler regime, I learned many things. The most important thing that I learned under those circumstances was that bigotry and hatred are not the most urgent problems. The most urgent, the most disgraceful, the most shameful, and the most tragic problem is silence. A great people which had created a great civilization had become a nation of silent onlookers. They remained silent in the face of hate, in the face of brutality, and in the face of mass murder. America, he says, must not become a nation of onlookers. America must not remain silent. Not merely Black America, but all of America. It must speak up and act, from the president down to the humblest of us. Listen to the following. And not for the sake of the Negro, not for the sake of the Black community, but for the sake of the image, the idea, and the aspiration of America itself. These are powerful words, right? And they embody a certain attitude that existed, again, not just for American Jews, but for minority communities in which you believe that you're trying to make America live up to its ideals. And that if you're trying to advocate for certain groups, you gotta speak about everybody. You gotta speak about everybody, and in this specific example, you gotta collaborate and work with different people. The civil rights movement was led by leaders across racial lines, across religious lines, of people who said that for us to succeed, we gotta work together. So that's phase one. Phase one, again, what's good for the Jews? Good for the Jews and other minority groups is advocate for the rights of all. Let's go to phase two. It's gonna change a little bit, okay? Phase two, and let me give you some context, okay? But phase two is characterized by the rise of identity politics. Now, forget the way that you read about identity politics in the news today. Let me give you a more technical definition, okay? The way that historians talk about identity politics, especially in the 60s, is basically about embodying a political identity and a mode of political organizing that is proud of your group identity and that organizes politically around your group identity, okay? I'm gonna give some examples. It's gonna become clearer in the following example. But the rise of identity politics basically said, no. Enough with this, everybody let's work together and not highlight our differences when we're advocating for ourselves. Actually, we gotta explicitly be proud of our own group, really be proud of our own group, and explicitly advocate for the interest of our group. And you know what? You know what's the best way to achieve this, many would say? You gotta work with people from your own group. You gotta separate from these like movements in which everybody works together, and you gotta embrace an ideology of separatism, in which if you're advocating for, let's say, a Latin interest, you work with other Latin folks. If you're advocating for Black American interest, you work with other Black folks, right? You have to work with your group. Perhaps the best example of this is the work of Malcolm X. Malcolm X, who by many people is held up as a little bit of like the foil for Martin Luther King Jr., he's somebody who really embodied this attitude. And he's somebody who embodied the need for the Black community to work, with itself for its own interests and not actually to become integrated with other people. Let me read you a quote from a very famous speech that he gave shortly after the March in Washington. You don't have it with you, I'm just gonna read it, okay? This is a very famous speech that he gave in 1963 after the March in Washington, a speech in which he was very critical of the march. And he says the following. By the way, it's on YouTube, you can hear it, it's awesome, all right? He says, "It's like when you've got some coffee that's too black, which means it's too strong. what do? You integrate it with cream. You make it weak. But if you pour too much cream in it, you won't even know you ever had coffee. It used to be hot. It becomes cool. It used to be strong. It becomes weak. It used to wake you up. Now it puts you to sleep. You can listen to him saying it in his own words. It's awesome, okay? No, but he has a vision here, and he's not the only one. And by the way, this was not new for this time period. It's just that it became very visible in this time period. But it came up before in America as well in different activist circles. But what he's advocating for here, and what the rise of black militancy and black power and Black Panthers and different movements advocating for LGBTQ rights and feminist groups and all these other groups based around racial, ethnic, sexual identities, okay? What this orientation says is that to actually advocate for our groups, we gotta work with our groups and we gotta be explicit about our own interests. That's the ideology underlying identity politics. Now, what were the consequences for American Jews? If we're gonna do a little bit of navel gazing, right? What were the consequences for American Jews of the rise of this identity politics? One consequence, which we're not going to focus on, was what historians describe as the purge of white American Jewish leaders from the civil rights movement and growing rift, right, between different leaders in the civil rights movement. That's one consequence that I think a lot of people talk about, but I want to speak about a different consequence that some of us might not know. Recent scholarship, especially by Mark Dollinger, has argued the following. It said, you know how it influenced American Jews? American Jews actually learned from identity politics. Not everybody, let me give a disclaimer. There were many who still resisted it, but okay, but for the sake of our conversation. Many American Jews learned from the strategies and the goals of identity politics, okay? Maybe subconsciously, maybe consciously, right? They said, listen, if this is what's happening in the air, and these are all these groups that are advocating for themselves, shouldn't we also start speaking openly as American Jews? Shouldn't we start having more pride, visible pride in our American Jewish identity? Shouldn't we start focusing inwardly on our own specific interest? Now, again, there's many other factors that are going on historically, like the 6-Day War we can talk about, or we can talk about multiculturalism, ethnic revival. All these other things are true, but I'm talking here right now specifically about the effects of the rise of identity politics in the American Jewish psyche. If you go to page 4, I'm going to read a quote from Mark's book, in which he describes different examples of this adoption. So he writes, as the last paragraph, page 4, as Donald Feldstein, an education consultant hired by the National Jewish Welfare Board to study college-age Jews, reported in 1970, quote, it is no longer embarrassing or out to belong to a group on the college campus with the word Jew in the title. He noted, literally scores of Jewish groups forming on college campuses across the country with aggressively Jewish missions that imitated the spirit, the style, and the tactics of the New Left and Black militants. This is just one example. His book, by the way, has so many. I'm happy to share it afterward. This is just one example. We see in this time, a time of rising identity politics, we see other things that in the American Jewish experience that signify an inward turn and investing in our own interests. If you look at the sources on pages 5 and 6, which you can read later, we have the rise of Zionism as a commitment that most American Jews adopt. We have the rise, for example, of Jewish feminism, right? As a movement that exemplifies identity politics, both in terms of women and feminism, and also in terms of their Jewish identity. We have the movement to save Soviet Jewry, a movement in which American Jews marched in the streets with visible Jewish symbols, which wasn't so common before this time, right? They marched in the street advocating for the rights of Jews openly. They're not marching in the street saying, we're advocating for everyone's rights. They're saying, we're here, we want to talk about a Jewish problem, okay? Many of the ways in which some of us think the American Jewish community is strong or robust might actually have been shaped by the rise of identity politics. If we're honest with ourselves, okay? Might have been shaped, I'm gonna take out the might, were shaped, okay? By the rise of identity politics. So friends, let me remind you, we said, what is good for the Jews? Phase one, good for the Jews and other minority groups, advocate for everyone's rights. Phase two, what is good for the Jews and other minority groups, advocate for your group rights. Phase three, I said, things are complicated. We're not sure how to answer the question. So let's go to phase three. To understand part of the problem and the disorientation that we have right now, we have to understand different narratives, right, that coexist simultaneously. What happened in the post-war era, we can talk here about really 70s, 80s, you know, there's different ways to kind of cut up this time, is that Jews in America, not everyone, but a lot of Jews in America, became wealthier. They moved to the suburbs. They negotiated a wider identity. Like Eric Goldstein would say, they didn't become white, they negotiated, right? A white identity, which means they were seen and treated as white. They became more politically powerful. In a sense, they were still a minority community. But if we talk about minority community, not only in terms of numbers, but in terms of power, right? They benefited much more from the majority social structures. Now, none of these trends or developments preclude or took away the fact that American Jews, even as they became more powerful and wealthier and wider, still had a very strong memory of having been oppressed and having been marginalized and having been vulnerable. And in some sense, American Jews it's hard to like speak past present, right? To kind of maintain both, to enjoy their place in America while still remembering or talking about our vulnerability. There's something almost paradoxical about this, because scholars who talk about this time period, they say, you know, all the old problems that Jews used to have of discrimination and anti-Semitism, they weren't fully gone, but they became much lessened in this period. The new problems that Jewish leaders are talking about are actually of like too much acceptance, right? America is too welcoming. It's too tempting. They love us too much. We have grappling with questions around intermarriage, around assimilation, and actually facing a totally new challenge of what does it mean to be a minority community that has a high social capital and that is welcomed, right? So that's one thing that is happening. Let's hold this here, okay? Like this American Jewish historical development of more power while still maintaining a consciousness of vulnerability. At the same time, scholars describe that left activists and progressive activists, and specifically Black activists, begin developing a more binary notion, a more rigid notion of people who are powerful and people who are powerless, of people who are white and people who are not white, people who are people of color, of people for whom the American dream works and people on whose backs that American dream has been built. And there was something both ideological and politically strategic about saying we need to maintain this separation. We need to be able to speak about those who are powerful and those who are powerless. Okay? Do you begin seeing a little bit of the tension, right, between these two things? We have an American Jewish community that has a bit of a messier narrative, wanting to inhabit both powerfulness and powerlessness, and we have a rising consciousness that says, you cannot be both. You gotta pick a side. I wanna read something that to me expresses this very powerfully. And I'm gonna warn you, this is not for the faint of heart. And I really feel like it's painful every time I read it, but it's an important essay to read. If you go to page 7, this is an essay by author and civil rights activist James Baldwin, who was actually trying to grapple with the rise of what he called Negro anti-Semitism. He was trying to grapple with the growing tensions between the Black community and the Jewish community. Let me just be clear, because we're not going to read the full essay. At no point does he legitimate okay, anti-Semitism. He doesn't. But he actually tries to understand what is giving rise to these tensions. What is making this so fraught? And he basically says, and I'm paraphrasing, and then we'll read it a little bit. He basically says, you can't have it both ways. You can't have it both ways. You can't benefit from systems that exploit minority populations and keep talking of yourself as vulnerable. You can't do that. It becomes painful and perverse and harms relationships between communities when you do that. Let's read a little bit. And again, this is not easy to read. If we're honest with ourselves, it's not easy because there's, because it's not fake news. Okay, page 7, first 2 paragraphs. It is galling to be told by a Jew, and he's speaking here specifically about the experience of like slumlords and individuals who are living, black folks who weren't allowed to live in certain neighborhoods, so they had to live in other neighborhoods that were off, and they were often paying rent to Jewish landlords. It is galling to be told by a Jew whom you know to be exploiting you that he cannot possibly be doing what you know he is doing because he is a Jew. It is bitter to watch the Jewish storekeeper locking up his store for the night and going home, going with your money in his pocket to a clean neighborhood miles from you, which you will not be allowed to enter. Nor can it help the relationship between most Negroes and most Jews when part of this money is donated to civil rights. In the light of what is now known as the white backlash, this money can be looked on as conscience money, merely as money given to keep the Negro happy in his place and out of white neighborhoods. One does not wish, in short, to be told by an American Jew that his suffering is as great as the American Negro's suffering. It isn't. And one knows that it isn't from the very tone in which he assures you that it is. The full essay is online. I recommend reading it in its full capacity. It's very, very powerful, very haunting. And if we're honest, it brings up difficult questions for us to grapple with. Now, Baldwin isn't talking about this, but I want to give you an example that to me also represents what he's saying. An example of the systems which helped Jews become prosperous and powerful, and which were simultaneously systems that, there were systems of oppressions that served white folks and not black Americans. One example that historians give, or one factor they describe that helped post-war Jewish prosperity is the GI Bill, okay? The GI Bill was a bill for World War II veterans that helped them get very low interest loans easily to be able to purchase homes, to go to college, and to achieve financial security. It's one of the ways in which American Jewish veterans coming home actually became wealthier and achieved prosperity in America. Now you might tell me, what's wrong with that? The GI Bill is great, we're helping our veterans, right? I mean, I would agree with you in theory. I think in theory it's great. But in practice, what ended up happening, and what historians say right now, specifically Ira Katznelson, is that the GI Bill was actually structured in a way that accommodated Jim Crow, okay? Even though in theory it was meant to help, let's say, all American veterans, what happens when you have banks who refuse to serve black Americans and give them loans? What happens when you have neighborhoods that don't allow black Americans to buy there? What happens when you have colleges, especially in the South, that don't admit them to universities? What happens? I'm not saying this was intentional from the American Jewish point of view. Let's be generous for the sake of this conversation. I'm not saying it was intentional to use systems that were racist. But even if it was intentional, if we take what Baldwin is saying seriously, then what does it mean that we've achieved power and prosperity benefiting from systems that directly benefited white people and excluded black Americans? That's the question. That's the question, right? Now, friends, if I was given this class when I started at Hartman 5 years ago, I would end here. Okay? I would say the tensions are coming up because we continue talking of ourselves as vulnerable, but we aren't. We're powerful. And that's the critique that we have to actually take inside our heart and grapple with it and do a cheshbon nefesh, an accounting of our actions and our souls, and do tshuva, like trying to figure out what we can do in terms of making things better, I would end here. But it's not 5 years ago. It's 2019 right now. And there's been several developments that have happened that make the story even more complicated. Even more complicated. I'm speaking, of course, about the rise of anti-Semitism. I'm speaking about the rise of anti-Semitism around the world, and in America. We've seen anti-Semitism. I'm not sure it ever went away, but we've seen it rear its ugly head in a way that I think has taken so many of us and has shocked us to our core, because we thought we were past this. And we thought America was better than this. We thought this couldn't happen in America. We had that beautiful American Jewish story, that America was exceptional, that America was a safe refuge in which anti-Semitism wouldn't flourish. But unfortunately, what we've been not only seeing, but we've paid with Jewish lives, okay? We've seen a rise in anti-Semitism by the way, that transcends countries, transcends partisan divides, okay? We've really seen a rise in anti-Semitism that have reminded us that we're not only powerful, that we're also vulnerable. Let me give you one example of this, and I want to thank Yehuda Kurtzer who pointed this out to me as a very powerful image. Go to page 12. This was the front page of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette just a couple of days after the shooting in the Tree of Life synagogue, in which a white nationalist killed 11 Jews as they got together for prayer. And this is a very, very powerful and symbolic image. And what I want to argue here is that this image represents both the acceptance of Jews, the success of Jews, the power, if we want to say, of Jews, but also the vulnerability of American Jews. Why am I saying both power and vulnerability? Success and vulnerability. Success, because this is the front page of an American newspaper, and it has in Hebrew the words of the Kaddish, of the traditional Jewish mourners' prayer. Itgadal ve'itkadash shemeh Rabbah. It's as if America is telling us, your tragedy is our tragedy. Your words of mourning are our words of mourning. We mourn together. You're one of us. You are accepted. There's something very powerful here about the story of arrival of American Jews, that our tragedy is not only mourned in our newspapers, with our language in a way that is inaccessible to others. This is an American tragedy, the paper is telling us, and we have to mourn it as one. And this, by the way, reaffirms part of the American Jewish exceptional story, that we've made it, that even though we have these bumps on the road, no, I don't want to call it a bump on the road, I'm sorry, even though we have these tragedies, that we're still on the road to make America better and to make it work for everyone. But we can't forget the vulnerability, right? The tragic aspect of this, because the Kaddish is written there to mourn, to remember the 11 Jews who were killed just because they were Jewish. And they remind us that most of our synagogues and Jewish schools, Jewish institutions, need to have security guards today in America. And that we can't just walk inside. And that we can't take our safety for granted. Maybe we never could, but now we actually know it. That we cannot take our safety for granted. There's something very complex, very messy about the current American Jewish moment. And this is why I said in phase 3, when we ask what is good for the Jews, it's like it's really hard to answer. It's really hard to answer. Part of the reason why it's hard to answer is because our narrative is misaligned. We're speaking a different language than other minority communities. Part of the ways that it's misaligned is that we talk about embodying both power and vulnerability. And that embodiment of both things does not fit in the binary that has been constructed, trying to distinguish between those groups who are powerful and those groups who are vulnerable. That's part of the misalignment, right? embodying a complex narrative of liminality, of fragility, naming our power and also our vulnerability. That is misaligned with a discourse that is trying to say, friends, we gotta choose sides. We gotta understand who's sustaining, maintaining the power structures, and who's being oppressed by it. And there's different groups that belong on different sides of the equation. This is my answer, my argument, as to why these moments feel so disorienting, so destabilizing, because we both have to grapple with a rising sense of vulnerability that we didn't feel before. We also have to grapple with the fact that we are powerful, okay? By the way, the best example of this is that in the last presidential election, both sons-in-law of the major candidates were visibly Jewish. To me, that's like, whoa. We take it for granted, but this is like, whoa, historically, okay? It's a big deal. So we have to grapple with our vulnerability. We have to grapple with moral questions about our power, and we have to grapple with the fact that we seem to embody both, even while the left critique tells us that we cannot embody both. That's the answer to the first question. Let me go to the second question, and I promise you it's not going to be as long as the first question, okay? Don't worry, we'll have time for questions. The second question that I said is that I don't want to only engage in diagnosis. Because right now this was a little bit of diagnosis, important diagnosis, but still diagnosis. But I want to ask some moral questions. And the moral question is, what does it mean to take this critique seriously? What does it mean to confront it and the questions that it poses to us seriously, in a serious way? What does it mean to embody this complexity and not to run away from the disorientation that the current moment presents us? Now, the good news and the bad news is that we've been here before, okay? I don't know if that makes you feel optimistic or pessimistic. We can, have different lines. The good news and the bad news is that we've been here before. In our tradition, we've grappled with these questions before. We've grappled with the experience of liminality, of actually feeling both powerful and powerless, or at least being powerful and then being very quickly powerless, or things shifting very quickly. I want to give you one example. Go to page 13. I want to give you one example. And this was mentioned yesterday after Ilana's class by someone who asked a question, I don't know who, but someone said, what about Joseph? And I was like, great, that's a great segue for tomorrow. What about Joseph? We're going to read a little bit about Joseph's story. Now, I got to tell you, I grew up as a kid with stories of the Torah, of the Bible. Those were like my bedtime stories. And I kind of loved the Joseph story, okay, if I'm being honest. I thought, okay, this is the good, happy part before we get to Exodus, and things kind of fall apart. I don't know if any of you felt this way before, but I was really happy. We have the son of Jacob who's sold by his brothers as a slave in Egypt. Then he kind of rises through the ranks, becomes second to the king, to Pharaoh. Then he reunites with his family, forgives them somehow, and then brings them there, feeds them, takes care of them. It's like happily ever after, and then we have Exodus, okay? So that's the way that I used to think about it. But as an adult, okay, as I reread and studied the story in Bereshit at the end of Genesis, right, as I reread as part of my parasha, my weekly portion learning, I realized this story is a little bit darker than that. If I'm being honest with myself, it's a little bit darker than that. Because we are told at the beginning of Genesis 47 in page 13, we are told that Joseph takes his family, his brothers, his father who he forgave, okay? He takes his entire family, and there's a famine in the land, right? In Canaan and in Egypt. And he tells them, I'm going to take care of you. I'll take care of you. You won't experience starvation. There's a reason why I'm in this powerful place. And the reason perhaps is to help my family. An instinct, by the way, that feels very human and familiar to me. Okay, I love my family. I would love, if God forbid anything happened, to have the ability to help your family. It's like, what else do we want? So that's the beginning of that. That's what Genesis 47 tells us. So in verse 12, Joseph sustained his father and his brothers and all of his father's household, which, by the way, means there were also women in the family, with bread down to the little ones. Now, what we keep reading, and I'm going to paraphrase a little bit, what we keep reading in this chapter is that even though Joseph's family, which settled in Goshen, was taken care of, this wasn't the case with the rest of the Egyptians. The rest of the Egyptians were slowly experiencing starvation. And they take, the text tells us, they take all their money and they go to Joseph and they buy whatever grain they can. But then they run out of money and they're still hungry. So they go to Joseph, and Joseph, the text tells us, he's acting in orders in the name of the king, of Pharaoh. So I'm not arguing this is about personal greed, but whatever. Joseph is acting in the name of Pharaoh and to serve Pharaoh. Joseph tells them, okay, let's do a barter. Do you have any livestock left? Any animals? They say, yeah, we do. Give me your animals, I'll give you grain. They give their animals, he gives them grain to eat. The story doesn't end there though, because they run out of food and they're hungry. So they come back to Joseph and they say, and maybe they now understand that they need to barter in some ways. And they say, listen, we have nothing else to give you. No more food, no more livestock. You know what we have? We have our lands and we have our bodies. So the text says that they basically made a deal with Joseph. They said, Pharaoh is going to now, I'm going to use modern terms anachronistically, nationalize all of our private properties. And we're going to become, the Hebrew for this is avadim. We're going to become, you can translate it as slaves or serfs. Okay, not clear. We're going to become some sort of serfs for Pharaoh, in which we work to eat. We work to eat and for our children to have food. Go to verse 20. So Joseph gained possessions of all the farmland of Egypt for Pharaoh, every Egyptian having sold his field because the famine was too much for them. Thus the land passed over to Pharaoh. And he removed the population town by town from one end of Egypt's border to the other. We should be surprised by this verse, by the way. It's like, whoa, what? Population transfer? What does this have to do with food and grain and all that? We'll get there. Verse 22. Only the land of the priest he did not take over, for the priest had an allotment from Pharaoh, and they lived off the allotment which Pharaoh had made to them. Therefore, they did not sell their land. What does this mean? There were actually some groups that got food without having to sell their lands or their labor. One group were the priests. What's the other group? Any guesses? His family, Joseph's family, the Israelites. Okay? That's the other group. We are told, if you go to verse 27, thus Israel settled in the country of Egypt, in the region of Goshen. They acquired holdings in it and were fertile and increased greatly. Do we see a little bit of a dissonance between the experience of the Egyptians during the famine and the experience of Joseph's family itself? Right? There's a little bit of a dissonance. One population undergoes population transfer, become serfs, lose their lands, and the other becomes wealthier and becomes bigger and more fertile. Now, there's many ways to interpret this text. Let's be honest about that. We can read this in many different ways. There's ways to have a generous read of this text. I wanna like really name that. Okay, you can read Yosef as acting under imperial orders. You can read him as trying to figure out a way to feed the people. There's ways to read this in a generous way. But I'm going to offer a less generous reading. And I'm inspired here by different commentators, amongst them Bechor Shor, and different rabbinic teachings, and I'm going to name them soon. The other way to read this, and it's both dark, and it's also human, and it's complicated. The other way to read this, the less generous way, is that Joseph needed to take care of his family. And he wasn't in the best environment in the world, right? It's like Egypt wasn't known, ancient Egypt wasn't known as a multicultural, safe refuge for refugees. Like, that wasn't exactly what it was famous for. Let's just put it like that. So suddenly Joseph, and I feel the psychological pain. Suddenly Joseph is responsible for his entire family. He's brought them here because they were hungry, and he knows that this is not simple. And that he knows that their entire fate is on his shoulders and he has to take care of them. So what does he do? He establishes policies that both serve the interest of the crown, but that also serve his personal interest to preserve his family. Let me give you one example of this. And this I'm drawing here from the Talmud in Chulin, in which they say the following. They ask, why was this population transfer necessary, right? Because it's a little bit odd. Like, what's Joseph doing with this population transfer? And one of the answers given is as follows. Because Joseph didn't want his family to be the only population of strangers in the land of Egypt. Get what I'm saying here? If to be a stranger is dangerous, is to be alien is dangerous, because everybody in the neighborhood knows each other and you're the different one. If that is dangerous, then what's one way to solve for it? Make everyone an alien. Make everyone a foreigner. Make everyone have to move to a new place so that they don't have their own comfortable setting in which they have security. Do you understand what we're saying here, right? One way to read this, and I admit that there's many ways. One way to read this is that as Joseph went about to establish his family's continuity and prosperity and position in this new country, he used systems that were built on the backs of others. That's one way to read what is going on here, which reminds me of what Ilana said yesterday, are we Rabbi, are we Antoninus, right? That's one way to read what is going on here. Now, if I'm reading this, and in light of our conversation that we just had, and if we ask questions about the left critique of the American Jewish story and our moral responsibility, my answer would be, a moral responsibility is to take seriously the fact that we have privilege, the fact that we have power, and to investigate exactly how we acquire that power and that privilege, and at the expense of who. To investigate the human price that other people have paid for our success. Not just to investigate it, but to reckon with it, and to ask ourselves, what is our moral responsibility in light of this? That's one moral orientation that I draw from the Joseph story, and that for me helps respond to the left critique. But as I said before, Genesis is one part of the story. And we go to Exodus. And every year, Jews around the world sit in their seders, and they read the Haggadah, the story of Passover. And we don't talk about Joseph so much. We talk about the Pharaoh that came after Joseph. The Pharaoh that the text tells us forgot Joseph. And we remind ourselves that in just one generation, the fortune of Jews completely shifted. They moved from being a protected, you can claim, powerful minority, to being not only slaves, but the target of genocidal policies by the new Pharaoh. Right? We say in every generation they stood up against us. Many of us like to think of that Pharaoh as perhaps the first anti-Semite, right? The first one that pointed to us and said, this is a people that's different than us and that wants to attack us, and so let us deal with them first before they can help us. First conspiracy theory. And by admitting that the narrative doesn't end in Genesis and continues in Exodus, we remember again that Jewish bodies and Jewish memories have the scars to prove that power and success are contingent, that they are fragile, that they are not timeless, that they change. We have the scars to prove it. We have the scars to prove the fact that you cannot only talk about power without admitting the possibility of vulnerability, without admitting that there are groups that can embody both, either at the same time or very quickly, one after the other. That's really the message, the lesson, right, of the Passover story, the Exodus story. The bitterness of the herbs, the bitterness of the maror, is not only about the slavery. That's one form of bitterness. The other layer of bitterness is that we know how quickly things can change. That's the bitterness. There's something so painful about it, right? That we know how quickly things can change, that we know we cannot guarantee safety. We cannot guarantee safety or prosperity in a way that's guaranteed and that will not change. So if my first moral orientation that I take in light of the left critique, if my first moral orientation is that we have to grapple with our power, my second moral orientation that I would love for us to consider, my second moral orientation is that American Jews have to speak confidently. Have to speak confidently and have to push back against the argument that you're either powerful or powerless. We have to stand up, talk about both our historical and our contemporary scars, talk about the fragility of Jewish power, the liminality of the Jewish experience, the complexity, the paradoxical nature of it. We have to push back against that part of the critique and say, it's not fully one or the other. It's not fully one or the other. You cannot classify us as only powerful. We are powerful and we have to grapple with that, but you cannot classify us as only powerful. We cannot only think of ourselves as powerful. We have to also grapple with vulnerability. And we have to grapple with the fact that we embody both power and vulnerability in a way that messes up the neat categories that underlie so many of the controversies and the critiques that American Jews are grappling with. Those are the two moral orientations that I draw as a response to this critique, as a response of what it means to grapple honestly, in a nuanced and honest way, with this critique. Friends, very soon, we're going to leave the walls of this Bet Midrash, or we're going to go back home, most of us to America. And my hope, and really what I want to leave us with, my hope is that we don't leave these questions only in this Bet Midrash, that we don't leave these questions only here, that we take seriously this week of learning about nationalism with all of the really messy and complicated questions that it brings up to us. And that when we go back home, we take on a commitment to continue grappling with them, especially as American Jews. We take on a commitment to ask the really difficult questions that are uncomfortable, that are destabilizing, that are inconvenient, the really difficult question, and to try both to understand some of what makes the moment so complicated and disorienting, but it's not enough to only understand, to also come up with moral commitments and moral orientations. The moral commitment of grappling with our power in a real way, and the moral commitment of developing a voice in the public square that explains and describes the complexity of the Jewish experience, that we inhabit both power and vulnerability. Thank you very much. All right, this is the harder part, okay? Questions. Friends, I'm gonna do something a little bit differently. I'm gonna take a couple of questions at a time, okay? Just because I wanna try to get as many voices in the room to ask questions. Please, when I ask you to ask a question, just say your name so that we all hear it loud and clear. Okay. Let me start, yes, question, please share your name with everybody, and then we'll take one more, okay. Yeah.
Dan Rubin from California. You know, and this hits very close to home for those of us that have children who are college students and aligned with some of these various groups. And I think you give us an interesting strategy to remind people about the vulnerability, but you look at James Baldwin's comments and saying, well, the next paragraph down, well, you say you're suffering, we're suffering greater. So the question is, how well does that argument work to say, well, we may have power, but we're also vulnerable. And many of the minority groups say, you have no idea what vulnerability might even mean. How well, I mean, I just thought of this argument, how well have you seen that work?
Great, thank you. That's one question. Yes? Yes. Let's wait for the mic.
Dorothy from New York. You're it's a brilliant presentation. This should be done on college campuses. This should be done in senior high schools. That's what that's how our kids will become more sensitized and more powerful at the same time, because they'll have a method to think through the same questions you're asking the adults. Please consider make a DVD and we'll spread it out.
Thank you.
Okay?
Well, the good thing is that, I work at Hartman, right? And in the back, I have amazing colleagues who help construct a lot of programming. So, okay. Let me take one more question over here. Yeah.
Randy from California. I love the merge of we are vulnerable and we are powerful. And that's a new way for me to look at it, and I thank you for that. I wonder, however, if we go to the public square to express that and examine that, are we in fact saying one more time that there's Jewish exceptionalism? And are we one more time saying our story is different? You can't categorize us because we're different, we're special. And is that going to make things worse?
Yeah. Wow. Such easy questions. I'm joking, I'm really joking here. Yeah, so let me start with Dan's question. And I think, Brandy, right? Your questions were both similar about how do we negotiate saying this in the public square. So there's a lot to be said. One thing I would say, and I work with college students and millennials as well, one thing that I would say is that I wouldn't recommend that Jews only go to the public square when they're trying to talk about their narrative. Now, let's be honest about this, okay? Sometimes some individuals is like, and you know what? I'll speak personally. Let me do my own, my own video. I became involved in my graduate student union at NYU when BDS came to the table. And one of the things that I realized afterwards is that there's something not so great about that, right? That I should have gotten involved earlier and dealt with other issues to show that I want to be there, not just to talk about the Jewish narrative and the Jewish narrative of vulnerability. So that's one thing that I would say, that it's really important to not only be there for our own self-interest, which I think sometimes there's a little temptation, and I spoke personally, right, to do so. The other thing that I'm going to say is that I don't think any of this is easy. I don't think any of this is easy. And part of what I hope to communicate here is I think the second goal is to convince others. Part of what I want to do first, though, is to understand ourselves. I think we are not even at a place where we confidently, or for confidence, when we honestly grapple with this complex narrative. So my first, if I was working with students and trying to talk about this, the first thing I would do wouldn't be, communications 101, how do you talk to others? But it's like, let's actually try to think about this internally. Let's try to understand this. How we communicate is a different question, and it's not easy at all. I think some of it has to do with building real relationships, real alliances in which you show that you are there not just for your own self-interest, but to communicate with others. And some of this, by the way, not everybody is going to be convinced. Like, it's not like I think we're going to win the argument by saying it over and over again. But we still gotta do it, just for our own, sense of moral responsibility and to be able to look at ourselves in the mirror. Brandy, I haven't thought about your question before, and I'm gonna think a lot about it. Brandy asked, are we just claiming to be special again by saying, we're both powerful and vulnerable? My first instinct is that I don't think the American Jewish experience of inhabiting both is fully unique. I think we can talk about this blurriness of the lines more generally. I just think that because of the historical trajectory of the Jewish people, right, and the way that we were minority communities for so long and in so many contexts, we happen to be an exceptionally good case study to talk about this. So I have to think more about whether we are reifying exceptionalism. My sense is that we can and should actually talk about this not only through our own experience, but also more generally. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Oh, okay. Yeah, and I want to remind everyone that we have another session later in which I can answer questions one-on-one. So yeah, and I'm going to go to the back. Yeah, I'm going to go. Yeah.
I'm curious, often the instinct is to focus on the vulnerability because that feels more urgent and dangerous to us. And I'm wondering how you suggest the collective have a conversation about power and privilege, especially between generations that want to focus on different things, given that urgency of the vulnerability.
Yeah, thank you. Let me take one more question, and I'm gonna, Danielle, yeah.
Hi, I'm Danielle. I'm also from Los Angeles. And I just also want to note that there are college students in the room, so I encourage you to ask them about their experiences rather than just sort of talking about them. And my question, sorry, I former Hillel professional, I had to say it. I'm also wondering, you mentioned that Jews are a great case study for talking about this both and sort of rejecting the binary. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how a conversation within and outside of the Jewish community around intersectionality, the idea that people hold more than one identity at once, is complicating this third phase, and also might be the opportunity to come up with what that third phase might look like in terms of what is good for the Jews.
Okay, intersectionality and and vulnerability. Okay, so to Maya's question, I would say, by the way, that I've seen both impulses. I've seen parts of the Jewish community that only want to focus on vulnerability, and I've seen parts that only want to focus on power. So I'm not sure that it's fully one-sided, even though I understand that depends where you're going in the Jewish community. I think sometimes we privilege one narrative over another. But you asked, how can we bring up these conversations about vulnerability? I think about power, right? In milieus where the discourse is really focused on vulnerability. So again, each context and case is different. My only suggestion or idea would be to not do it. To not do it lightly. What do I mean by this? Like in my first read of the Joseph story, I was like, oh, how dare he? And I was really, my first read as an adult, sorry. And I was really upset, and all I wanted to talk about was his power and privilege. When I read it again, and I tried to put myself in his shoes and tried to put myself in the agonizing place of having to secure my family's safety, I had a bit more sympathy for him. Doesn't mean that suddenly what he did became right, but it meant that if I was having a hypothetical imaginary conversation with him, that I wouldn't come to him with like accusing, like, you know what I'm saying? That I actually do the work to try to, again, not excuse, not legitimate, but try to first understand some of the dreams and nightmares. Understand the dreams and nightmares that are driving that discourse of vulnerability. And once we understand it, we can actually, I think, have a much healthier conversation. Because we say, you know, I get your dreams, I get your nightmares. They're really scary. I want to hear about them. I also want to talk to you about my dreams and nightmares, which have to do with having maybe too much power and oppressing others. So that's the way that I would encourage a conversation between different parts of the Jewish community that are inhabiting different narratives. Now, Daniel, your question about intersectionality, a bit general, but I think it was like, how does intersectionality help us understand this third phase better? Was this the question? Yeah, it totally complicates it. Okay, everybody know. By the way, everybody knows what intersectionality is, or do we want a quick recap? Okay, so intersectionality is a term that was originally coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, who basically was arguing that sometimes we have systems that tend to think of groups in very discrete ways. Let me give you an example. We have like a feminist discourse that focuses on women, okay? And then we have like a discourse in exploring racism that focuses on Black Americans. And she was saying, if we have these two different discourses, we're kind of missing a lot of things. One of the things that we're missing, and she uses this in her work, is, for example, the experience of Black women, who actually are part of two marginalized groups and who embody both, and who you can argue are experiencing interlocking systems of domination. And we cannot actually look at one without looking at the other. Okay, that's like basically the way the theory began. Now, intersectionality is not only used in this way, it's one of the ways that it's used, right? You know, the systems of domination compound. It's also used by different activists as scholars when they talk about intersectional movements or intersectional activism. What they mean by that, for example, is to say, you know, you as Latin immigrants might experience oppression X, and we as queer people of color might experience oppression Y, but we cannot fight our specific oppressions without realizing that they're somehow connected. So in terms of our activism and our alliances, we have to know that nobody is free unless everybody is free, and that we cannot address just one without addressing the other. That's a little bit of like a 101 on 1 foot, you know, intersectionality. It's more complicated though. But yeah, how does this complicate phase 3? It complicates phase 3 in so many different ways. One of the ways in that it complicates it is that I'm just trying to think about how I'm going to say this in like a neat way and also allow for more questions. So let me give one example of how it complicates things. It's not exhaustive. One of the examples in which it complicates things for the Jewish community is that intersectional discourse has adopted an international discourse of liberation. So what this means is that, for example, the Black Lives Matter activist or platform believe that their fight in America has an intersectional relationship with the fight of Palestinians in Israel. Okay, and that's why even as they're marching in the streets saying Black Lives Matter, they also hold signs saying, I actually don't know what the signs say, but let me make it up. Palestinian lives matter. I don't know what it is, right? So I think one of the ways, it's not exhaustive, one of the ways in which it complicates the story for American Jews right now is that we are grappling not only with like racial relations in our country and with trying to figure out how to respond and deal and internalize, right, the theory of intersectionality and what it tells us about dominion and oppression. But we also are grappling with the fact that the local context and the international context have somehow been tied together. Now, you might agree with that. You might say, well, they are tied together, so deal with it. Or you might resist that and said, no, actually, they shouldn't be tied together. We need to think about them separately. That's one way. I don't know if that's what you were going for, but again, we're meeting again later for any questions. That's one way in which the intersectional critique is confusing things. I think we have time for, let me take 2 more questions.
This is perhaps a very simple question. Zav Levinson, Montreal. I guess a simple question. I was reading your material this morning, and one thing that struck me, I for some reason never thought of it, Jews were never oppressed, never an oppressed group in America. And I wonder how that sort of impacts all these discussions compared to African Americans who were slaves, indigenous Americans who were slaughtered, etc.
So Zav said, and I'm going to take one more question before you address it, but in case you couldn't hear him, he said that from reading my sources, it might have seemed like Jews were never an oppressed group in America like other groups. Let me take one more question and then we'll,
College acceptance. Hi, I'm Zoe. I'm from New York. I would just like to echo the previous statement. There are 14 college students in the room, and we're happy to talk to you about what's happening on campuses. We come from campuses across the country. My question to you, I know you said you weren't really going to talk about this in the speech, but I was wondering how we can acknowledge our power and be vulnerable in a way that is more inclusive of Jews of color and non-Ashkenazi Jews.
So there were 2 questions. That question was, were Jews ever oppressed in America or were we exceptional historically? My answer to that would be that actually the historical record shows that the Jews as a group suffered tremendous discrimination and persecution in America. And I'll say something else now. Sometimes when we speak about race and we speak about white American Jews, we forget that whiteness has been contingent. What I mean by that is that scholars of American Jews, and Eric Goldstein for me is like the best one on this, would say Jews haven't always been treated as white in America. Okay, specifically, it talks about like the late 1800s, early 1900s, in which Jews were actually seen and treated as belonging to like the non-white population, which were excluded from systems of power and privilege in America. So I think, Jonathan Sarna, by the way, has a great article, either in Tablet or the Forward, but I can give it to you later. He has a really interesting article that he wrote after the shooting in Pittsburgh, in which he said, let's not fool ourselves. We've had anti-Semitism before, and he gives like a lot of examples. And at the same time, which I think makes his argument really intriguing, he says, but let's also not fool ourselves, this is not Europe or Nazi Germany, right? And then he actually qualifies the ways in which discrimination of Jews in America has been different than that in Europe. So I think there's like a really interesting history here. And part of what's important for me to say, like when I speak about this is, yes, most American Jews today benefit from systems geared for white folks, but it hasn't always been the case, right? We've actually, according to Goldstein, Jews were treated as white, then not, then yes. So like, it's contingent, and for him, it's about negotiating a white identity. Zoe asked, how can we, if I understood the question, how can we expand our sense of activism and inclusivity, and really include the experiences of Jews of color and non-white Jews in our conversation? Well, I think it's a great question. It's actually one of the impetus that I had from my research of Syrian Jews, trying to not only focus on race, also on ethnicity, and really to expand our understanding of non-Ashkenazi Jews in America. I mean, step one is to just is to be careful with our language. This sounds like simple, but it's actually really significant and really symbolic and really powerful. When we speak about American Jews, right, are we only speaking about one type of American Jew? When we speak about American Jewish food or American Jewish language or the American Jewish experience, are we essentializing it in very narrow ways? The first thing to do is to actually communicate and strengthen our discourse and speak up and say, I want to talk about other populations. I want to talk about the experiences of Jews of color who have an intersectional identity. Was that the question you were referring to? I wasn't sure where you were going, sorry. Who have an intersectional identity, right, of being both Jews and both Americans or non-Americans of color, and who actually are grappling with different challenges than ours. And to us, how do their experiences lead them to create a different Jewish American narrative than ours? And what can we do as a community to really expand our understanding of it? I really believe in the power of narrative. I really believe in it. I believe in the power of symbols, and I believe that it's not the last step, but it's a first step to speak up time and again, and to ask the difficult questions. I mean, I'm going to speak about my childhood again, but when I was in high school, and I went to an Ashkenazi Jewish day school in America, and like I had this curriculum, and it said, Jewish law, and then when I look at it, and I'm like, this is not Jewish law, this is Ashkenazi Jewish law. And I'm like, I went to my teacher, and I'm like, hey, could we change the title here? Like, cool for you to teach Ashkenazi Jewish law. You know what? No problem. Can we call it that? Can we call it that and not pretend like we just erased, right? A lot of other Jews. So I think we need to really work on our consciousness, our language, our narrative, and that's just the first step. But we're not even there yet. So I think that really needs to be a part of our focus right now. I want to thank everybody so much, and have a wonderful rest of the day.